First off, the most important thing is the lives of the people who live in the Donbass. They are facing extraordinary pressures, physical security, economic collapse, food security, environmental disaster, access to basic services, lack of freedom of movement, difficulties in crossing the boundary line into the rest of Ukraine. It is an extremely difficult situation for them, and it is getting worse over time. It's been 4 years of this, and it's a grinding humanitarian problem. To put it in context, more people have been killed in this war than were killed at Srebrenica. More people have been displaced as a European population displaced by war than at any time since World War II. So this is a major conflict going on and is affecting the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. We have to pay attention to this. The second point I would make is that we are very, very interested, the United States, our government is very interested in helping to bring about peace. We want there to be a peaceful solution. Right now, unfortunately, we have a situation where Russia has invaded and is occupying the territory, commands and controls military forces that are there, has set up these political entities that it then uses as a buffer to avoid its own responsibility. Russia needs to be serious about making peace as well, and we will be a faithful partner in bringing about peace if we can get Russia to make that kind of decision. With that, I'd like to take a break and answer questions, and first to the Associated Press. You need a microphone.
Is that on?
Okay, here we go.
Thank you. Mr. Volker, Kate Dupury, Associated Press. Why has there been so little progress in the establishment of peacekeeping force in the occupied territories for now over a year? And then a second follow-up to that, what is the next round of weaponry that Kyiv can expect from the US?
Concerning the deployment of a UN-mandated peacekeeping mission, Russia has insisted that this be limited only to protecting the OSCE monitors rather than creating security throughout the area. In addition, Russia is insisting that this be negotiated directly with the proxy entities, the so-called People's Republics, rather than with Russia itself when Russia is in fact the decision maker. And thirdly, Russia has insisted that Ukraine take political steps to implement the Minsk agreements further without there being security on the ground and before a peacekeeping force would deploy. And so under those conditions, it's impossible. So by creating these objections, Russia has effectively blocked the idea. This is something that the United States, Germany, France have very closely coordinated on with Ukrainian support, also with support from many other European countries, including Sweden, Finland, Austria, other European Union members, the UK, as well as Canada. But it is Russian objections on those points that has blocked this. Concerning the provision of support to Ukrainian defense capabilities, as you know, we made some steps on this last fall and into the early part of this year. And the significance of this is that we lifted the Obama-era arms ban. President Obama had put in place a ban on the sale of what he called lethal defensive equipment. That ban has been lifted. We did provide anti-tank weapons, javelins, and now we are prepared to treat Ukraine like any other normal country, which it is. And they have improved their defense capabilities significantly since 2014. There are still some gaps in those capabilities, and one can talk about where those gaps are. And we're prepared to sit down with Ukraine and look at what their needs are. They can buy things through our foreign military sales. Congress has appropriated funding for foreign military financing. So we'll deal with this in the course of normal business now and filling gaps of what Ukraine might find useful as it strengthens its defensive capabilities.
Okay. Can I?
Thank you. Mr. Volker, have you raised the concern with Mr. Surkov on so-called elections in DPR and LPR? And if there is an answer, are you yourself concerned about if the law on the special, we call it on the special, on the governance in the Donbass won't be adopted by the parliament this autumn? And depending on what the Ukrainian government can do, how you think they can make the life of the people in Donbass easier, like paying pensions or things like that? What depends on them? Thank you.
Okay, so that's 3 questions. First one on the suggestion that elections would take place in the occupied territories for the so-called People's Republics. That is a completely illegitimate exercise. And the State Department issued a statement on this just the other day. I've spoken about it publicly in the past. First off, these entities have no basis in legitimacy with the local population. They are contrary to the implementation of the Minsk agreements. They have no place under the Ukrainian constitution. And the holding of elections in a condition of occupation is impossible to do in a free and fair way. People need to be able to have different points of view. They need to be safe. They need to be able to move about. They need to campaign. And every legitimate voter needs to be able to vote. Those conditions are impossible today and impossible under a state of occupation. So such an election would be a tremendous setback to the implementation of the Minsk agreements, and in fact completely contrary to implementation of the Minsk agreements. Russia says it supports Minsk implementation, but the reality is that by holding these elections it would be doing the opposite. We do support the holding of legitimate local elections for legitimate local authorities, mayors, oblast administration, so forth. And that would take place if there were security in the area, and that would be created through the deployment of a UN-mandated peacekeeping mission. The second is on special status. Almost a year ago, the Rada here extended the legislation on special status, which had already been approved in the past. And neither after the first approval nor after the extension last year did Russia do anything to end the conflict, withdraw its forces, move towards implementing the Minsk agreements. So I understand the frustration that many Ukrainians feel about taking step after step and not seeing Russia take this seriously. That said, Russia will clearly use any decision not to extend special status as an excuse for not doing anything itself. So I don't think it's wise for Ukraine to give Russia that argument. In addition, if the law is extended, the situation the next day after the law is extended, would be exactly the same as the situation today. So there is absolutely no change there. And then finally, one of the things that I believe is extremely important is maintaining a strong sanctions regime in place based on Russia's aggression in Ukraine. As you all know, there are many voices in the European Union that would like to lift sanctions. Even though Russia has done nothing to implement its share of the bargain, there are nonetheless voices in the European Union that call for lifting sanctions. It will be harder to keep that argument and to keep the European Union together if Ukraine is seen as not following through on its share of the Minsk agreements, which would just be extending a law that would not change anything from the situation today. You had a third question? Thank you. So as I started with in my comments, the situation affecting the lives of people in the Donbass is the most important thing. And let me stress that these are, for the most part, Russian-speaking people that live in Ukraine. There are Russian-speaking people that live throughout Ukraine, in Kharkiv, in Slovyansk, in Odessa, in Kyiv, everywhere. The only place where Russian-speaking people in Ukraine are suffering is where Russia has intervened. where Russia has created an invasion and occupation. So if Russia cares about the well-being of Russian-speaking people, the first thing it should do is remove its occupation forces and agree to a UN-mandated peacekeeping mission. That being said, the Ukrainian government should take the opportunity to do as much as it can for these people. It is difficult under conditions of occupation, but at the same time, one can think of adding additional people at the boundary crossings to shorten the lines, improving the facilities, finding new ways to provide access to pensions for the most vulnerable people that live in those areas, working together with UN organizations, working together with the Red Cross to try to provide humanitarian relief to people that are living there. I think it is possible to take a very proactive stance, to be creative, and to make sure that the people of the Donbass know that the government of Ukraine views them as its citizens and that it cares about them.
Anya Tsukanova, Agence France Presse in Ukraine. I've got two questions. First of all, what do you think of the rising tensions between Ukraine and Russia in the Azov Sea? And are the United States ready to provide any specific military help to Ukraine? There were, for example, some talks from the Ukrainian side about island-class patrol boats. Can you confirm that there are ongoing negotiations about that? And do you fear that this might become a hot and armed conflict? And the second one is, have you got any the already famous interview of the Russian Skripal suspects to the Russian media? Thank you.
On the latter one, Russians have not lost their sense of humor. On the former, I already discussed the issue of U.S. defense assistance, so I think that's clear. And I would refer you to a statement made by the State Department just a few days ago also about the Sea of Azov. We are very concerned about that. We do not accept the Russian claims about the territory in the waters, and we believe that the presence of Russian military forces has become a very provocative and aggressive step. So we are very concerned about that.
El País. I am a correspondent here and also in Russia. I have two questions. What are the implications of Zakharchenko's death for you? If there are any, and lessons if there is any. That's one. And also, is there any progress in the question of exchange of prisoners? And the third would be, how quiet is the front line? Because looking from outside, sometimes it seems that it's a very mobile thing that's going on towards one direction and the other. Thanks.
Thank you. So first off, concerning the assassination of Zakharchenko, I think that just underscores how important it is that there be peace and security in the Donbass. As long as the Russian forces are there and these proxy entities are there and this occupation continues, it will be a volatile environment. I would also note that because Russia is the one in control of this area, despite the incident of his assassination, there is no fundamental change to the situation. We still face the same issue of Russia's command and control of the armed forces, creation of these proxy entities, and a continued pressure on Ukraine and a continued hot conflict. That gets to your third point. It is not quiet. And let's never make the mistake of assuming that this is some forgotten, frozen conflict, doesn't matter. There is fighting going on, mortars, snipers, artillery, tank fire, virtually every night. The OSCE is documenting this. And on average, a Ukrainian soldier is killed about every 3 days. I want you to take a minute and imagine in any country in Europe, if you were fighting on your own territory, not somewhere far away, not Afghanistan, in Valencia, and you are defending Valencia, and your soldiers are dying on Spanish territory on the average of 1 every 3 days. That's the situation that Ukraine faces. And it is a dire situation politically. Any government, anywhere, would not accept this. And it is critical that we get to a point where we can reestablish peace and security, and then see that the Minsk agreements are implemented, which means the restoration of that territory to Ukrainian control. On the exchange of prisoners, I know that there have been multiple efforts, both through the TCG, Trilateral Contact Group, and also bilaterally between the Ukrainian and Russian governments. Thus far, I don't believe any new breakthroughs have been made. We're very pleased to see the return of prisoners that took place around New Year's, but there hasn't been since then. And I have to say that I have met with families of prisoners, families of people who have been victims in the conflict, families of people who have been tortured. It is a terrible thing. And just as a humanitarian gesture, we would urge the Russians to agree to a further prisoner exchange.
And this will be our final question. Thank you.
Radio for Europe, Radio Liberty, Ukrainian service. And I would like to ask you again about the exchange of prisoners, because President Kuchma, former president of Ukraine, here at the sidelines of the conference said that he doesn't foresee any exchange of prisoners before the elections in Ukraine. And Professor McFall suggested that President Trump would use his personal relationship with President Putin to solve this issue and maybe help people like Oleg Sentsov, who is in hunger strike in Russian prison. And do you see such step from the US leadership more on this? And my second question would be about Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine is not planning to continue its long-standing treaty with Russia. Do you see any strategic risks about this?
On your last point about continuing a treaty with Russia, it's a bit farcical, isn't it? When you have Russia invading Ukraine and yet there's a treaty at the same time, it's just, you know, whether you abandon it or you don't abandon it, the reality is it's not, you know, it means nothing. On the exchange of, well, first off, on Mr. Sentsov, this is a particular case which I have raised and others have raised, and in fact Secretary of State Pompeo raised it by calling Foreign Minister Lavrov and said we urged the Russian government to find a way to assure his release as a minimum on humanitarian grounds, but in addition seeing the charges against him as rather specious. In terms of prisoner exchange more broadly, I just, you know, I have nothing to say. President Kuchma has his own assessment, which I respect, but I don't think anyone is going to stop working for the exchange of prisoners. I think we should continue to try to press for that, as I have done, and I'm sure others will do too.
Thanks very much, everyone.